next speaker is Professor Law, and he's also the president of Faculty Association.
Merced College Faculty Association. Thank you. And I'm the faculty advisor for Students for Social Justice as well. Thank you, everybody. First, I want the folks, CSEA, I believe, and the associated students are the folks who put out all those tombstones out on M Street. And if you haven't seen them, you've got to go see them. They're very impressive. It has a list. Every single tombstone is a course that was cut on this campus. Very impressive. And so a big hand for those folks who did the effort. They got here really early and put that up. So this morning I got a hold of my executive board, and we voted, I'll just read it to you verbatim. MCFA Executive Board supports the efforts of those on ASMC and CSEA who have worked to create our campus events in solidarity with the statewide protest against budget cuts to education. And so MCFA is going to give their support wholeheartedly to this effort. This effort today across California was started and planned at UC Berkeley. And there's a reason for that. I was listening to NPR on my way in this morning, and they were pointing out that they didn't want this to be about colleges, they didn't want this to be about K through 12, because a lot of times in the state, when it comes to budget fights, there's this infighting between them about who's going to get the money, and they're sick and tired of that. The point of this is education needs to be funded from kindergarten all the way through a college education. And we're not going to fight for the budget between these different systems. It's all one big system. We're all educating the same people. And so, as I pointed out to my class this morning, there's a reason why a message like this would come from a place like UC Berkeley, as opposed to another one of the universities that we would classify with them in terms of their hierarchy in our echelon of education in the state of California, which is the top, right? Up there with Stanford and even across the nation and across the world. UC Berkeley always ranks in the top, most Nobel Prize winners and things like this. So why would a UC Berkeley be interested in have this long history of progressive thought and instigating protest as opposed to a Stanford or a Yale or a Harvard? It's because it is a state university that's funded by the state where working class people go, and they get a great education and they learn to be progressive and forward-thinking people. If you go to a school that's filled with people who are coming from families that have millions of dollars, they're not going to be that motivated to progress because there's nothing for them to progress towards. They're already having it pretty well, right? So it's state-funded public education that we're talking about here. So I want to share, again, as I did with my class this morning, I teach philosophy for a living. So I want to take a bit of a philosophical approach to this. I want people to know that this is not about, and some people are going to turn this in this direction, this is not about any individual person in this crowd who wants the state or wants somebody else who's working for a living to finance your education. This is about a fundamentally recognized right that's internationally recognized and has a very long history in the political philosophy of this country, goes all the way back to our founding fathers. The right was best articulated in the United Nations, the United Nations Universal Human Rights, Article number 26, where it says exactly, everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. Now, this is in the United Nations, and every nation in the United Nations, including this one, have agreed to this, at least philosophically, that this is something that we need to aspire to have a just society. More locally and more at home, rather than the United Declaration of Human Rights. And by the way, here's a picture of the folks that put this together with Eleanor Roosevelt right up front there. And it's folks, there's representatives here from China and Russia and India and everywhere else, right? It's very cross-pollinizing representation of the international community who put together the Declaration of Human Rights. Closer to home here, our very own Thomas Jefferson, one of our favorite of the founding fathers, has on his tombstone, and I quote, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. And then in his orders he said, and not a word more. And the reason why he put University of Virginia on there was because for him it was his most highest standing achievement. And he wrote, when he was trying to put together the contracts to form the government of Virginia, he wrote a lot about the need of education, and including public education, for the governance of society. And I'm going to read some things here from Jefferson. Here's an argument for the preparation of the voter, and he has 4 conditions. Number 1, that democracy cannot long exist without enlightenment. Number 2, that it cannot function without wise and honest officials. Number 3, that talent and virtue needed in a free society should be educated regardless of wealth, birth, or other accidental condition. And number 4, that the children of the poor must be thus educated at common expense. He's talking about government education, right? Here's another line from Thomas Jefferson, and I'll just read this one, a paragraph. In the Constitution of Spain as proposed by the late Cortes, that any person born after that day should ever acquire the rights of citizenship until he could read and write. It is impossible sufficiently to estimate the wisdom of this provision. Of all those which have been thought of for securing fidelity in the administration of the government, constant ralliance to the principles of the Constitution and progressive amendments with the progressive advances of the human mind or changes in human affairs, it is the most effectual. Enlighten the people generally, and tyranny and oppression of body and mind will vanish like evil spirits at the dawn of day. The diffusion of knowledge among the people is to be the instrument by which it is to be effected. And another famous line by Jefferson is, and some of you probably know this one, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. So those are the arguments that go right to home in our American tradition for public education. And then what I would like to do is wrap it up with a little excerpt of a recent editorial that I put in the Sun-Star, because this brings it home to us here in Merced College. The changes to public education that are currently being proposed, and I think Hiram did a very eloquent job of explaining to you what all those were in terms of class cuts and raising your tuition and what have you. The changes to public education that are currently being proposed by many politicians and administrators include increasing class sizes, cutting student programs, and using cost-cutting delivery systems. Most of these measures are as old as the Reagan-era Proposition 13 tax cuts, which caused California's slide from one of the top to one of the bottom 10 states in the nation in per-student funding for public education. And it's very important to remember that in the 1970s, we paid more per student per capita than we were in the top 10 in the entire nation. And now we're 46th in the nation from the 70s to today in expenditures per student in K-12 education. There can be no doubt that these measures will further erode public education and thereby threaten our economic and political well-being. And I'm getting that right from Thomas Jefferson. Can't get more patriotic than that. A friend of mine taught at Head Royce, which is a preparatory school in the Bay Area where tuition is over $20,000 and 100% of the graduating class of 2009 enrolled in a college or university. 100%. One of the keys to success that Head Royce advertises is its 9-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio. Contrast Head Royce with Merced's K-12 public school system, where 25% of our students drop out and only 25% of those who graduate qualify for college. As a result, 90% of the students who enter Merced College must take remedial courses, and there's no shame in that because that's how I started my college education as well, and I feel very proud of my college education. As I regularly point out to students, one main difference between Head Royce students and them, and that's you, has less to do with IQ than it has to do with the difference in the resources that were provided to prepare them for success. The fact that Merced College students are playing catch-up with their peers explains why we should resist adopting the cost-cutting measures listed above. The fact that our students were shortchanged in their preparatory years means that they require more rather than less instructional attention. Before we raise tuition and cut costs, we should address the fact that in spite of all appearances, California is not poor. We just have yet to demand the proper funding of public education, and again, this goes all the way back to the 1970s. It is assumed that the plight of California's education system is tied to the national recession. However, though the economy has slowed and tax revenues are down, and you can just look around Merced and you can see that, as of 2008, California's $1.8 trillion GDP was the largest in the country. If California was a standalone nation, we would be among the wealthiest 10 in the world. The problem is not that California is poor. It is that the bulk of our wealth goes to the wealthiest families, those who can afford to send their children to schools like Head Royce.